In the previous video, we saw how to add and customize labels in our apps, which is a great way of displaying information, but it's no good for having any kind of interaction with the user. So in this video, we're going to see two more user interface element types, the text field and the button. So if we search for text in the object library, we'll see the text field there. So let's just drag that in. And I'm going to center it just underneath the hi there label that we added in the previous video. And you can see it takes on the standard iOS look. And just like with labels, we can stretch them out. So I'll stretch this one out to the end of the screen. And let's just have a quick look before we customize this text field, how it responds in the app itself. And there it is. And you can see if we tap in the text field there, you can see that the iOS keyboard pops up. And we can even type in it and get a response. Although it's a little slow on my simulator here. Yours should be a bit faster. It's worth noting as well that if you have a look in the hardware menu, then you can decide whether you use the hardware keyboard or the software keyboard. Or indeed, both. So at the moment we're using both. I can type in using the software keyboard, although as I say, it's pretty slow. But I can also type in just using my normal keyboard, which is a little bit quicker. So I'm going to be using that for the rest of this course. So most of the time you're going to want to keep your text inputs pretty close to the default. They look pretty good anyway, and they're what people are going to be expecting to see if they are required to enter some text. But there are a few options that are worth being aware of. So as before, we can change the color if we really want to. That will change the color of the text inside. We can have some text there by default if we want to, but more common is to use what's known as a placeholder, which is better than entering default text, because if you have a placeholder, it will tell the user to do something, and then when they tap on that box, then the placeholder disappears and they can start typing. Whereas if you put text into a box, they have to manually select and delete that text before they can enter anything. So generally you're going to want a placeholder rather than text for a text input. I'm just running that to show you that in action. And here we go. So there's my text box. And when I tap in it, then I can just start writing. And the placeholder text disappears. See, my beta version is not the speediest here. Yours, as I say, should be quite a bit faster. Okay, so that's placeholders. We can add a background image there if we want to. We can add a background image for when the text field is disabled. We can change the border style, just like that, although I'd recommend keeping it at the default. We can decide whether there is a clear button. That is the little X that appears on the right here. We can even opt to clear every time the user starts editing. We can adjust the minimum font size, and we can choose to adjust the text size to fit in the box if we want to. Now these options are very useful. Depending on what's going to be entered, we might want some sort of capitalization. If we're entering, say, a username or something like that, then we wouldn't. But if we were entering a name, then we'd probably want each word to be capitalized. And we can change the options there if we want to. We can switch on and off corrections and spell checking as well. And very usefully, we can change the default keyboard type. So if we wanted to enter a phone number, for example, we can make sure that it's the number pad that appears when the user taps in that box. And we can also choose email address and various other types of data entry that we might need. It's definitely worth paying attention to that. It makes your app a lot more usable if the user is presented with the right type of keyboard. And we can change the appearance there, and we can customize the word on the return key as well. And down here we've got some alignment options, and we can decide whether it's enabled, selected or highlighted. And again, just like with labels, we've got some view modes that we rarely use with text fields, so I'm not going to pay much attention to those right now. Unlike with labels, user interaction is enabled because by default we're going to want the user to be able to type something in, but we're not going to want multiple touch most of the time. And again, we've got the options of setting an alpha to show how opaque or transparent we want the text field to be, and we can choose a background and a tint color as well. And those same options as with labels that you're unlikely to want to edit. So that's how text fields work. Now let's see how we work with buttons in iOS development. Unsurprisingly, you search for button and then we just drag it in. So again, I'm going to center our button and display it right there. So in iOS 10, as in previous versions, buttons are pretty minimalist. They're just by default blue text. But just with labels, we can change the content of the button. And again, just like with text fields, we'll just run the app to see what the default effect of a button is without changing any of these options. And here we go, there's our button. So when I tap it, you get this nice buttony effect without having to do anything. Of course, that button won't actually control anything in our app until we write some code for it, which is what we'll be doing in the next video. So let's just quickly run through some of the button options. We can choose from a number of different button types. Almost always you're going to want the system button, but there are some defaults, for example, an info button, which looks like that, and some other options there. But as I say, the vast majority of the time we'll want a system type button. In fact, I just used undo Command Z to get back to what we had before. Buttons have states. So the states here are default, which is when the button is just on the screen but not being pressed. Highlighted is when the user has tapped on it. Focused, we don't generally use for buttons. With the text field, for example, when the text field is focused, that means the cursor will be on it and the user will be able to type something into it. But usually with buttons, if it's being pressed, then it's highlighted. So we don't really need to worry about the focused state for buttons. Again, selected as well, we don't generally use for buttons. Disabled we might use if we want to show that some option is not available for some reason. So the major two that you work with for buttons are default and highlighted. So looking at the default, we can choose again plain or attributed, just like with the labels, and we can change the font, color, shadows, image, and a background image if we want to. I won't go into all of those as we've seen how they work with labels, but feel free to play around with them if you like. We've got a few effects that we can apply. You can play with if you want to. Reverses on highlight, shows touch on highlight, and working with the button image. We can choose where the line break comes. And as before, we've got some options that we're unlikely to want to change at this point. And the familiar user interaction enabled, alpha, background, etc., as we've seen before. All right, so I'm just going to clear the page here and set you a quick challenge. And in this challenge, I want you to create this mini form. So all we're doing is asking for the user's email address. We're going to have the form aligned to the right of the screen for some reason, just to practice that, and then a submit button at the bottom. That's all you need to do. Go for it. All right, I hope you managed that. Let's start by adding our label. So I'm going to line it to the right where the blue is, the blue guiding line. And then I'll just double click, what is your email address? There we go. and that actually aligns itself just right. So then I'm going to bring in my text field. I'm going to drag that in the now hopefully familiar way. And you can see when we've got more than one element, it aligns or gives us the option to align the second element with the first. So that will then give a nice bit of space between the label and the text field. And I'm going to drag that out and use the blue marking lines again to make those the same width. I'm going to add a placeholder. Enter your email. And bonus points if you did this, I'm going to choose the keyboard type to be email address. And then finally, I'm going to add my button aligned nicely and just change to submit. There we go. And as always, when we've done a layout, I'm just going to run it on the simulator to make sure it looks the same in the flesh, as it were. And there we go. You can see it's all nicely right aligned. And even when we click in the email address, you can see we've got the email keyboard here because we've got the @ symbol and the dot at the bottom. So there we go. We can now add labels, text fields, and buttons to our apps, but so far we're not able to actually make them do anything. To do that, we need to learn a little bit of code, Swift code to be precise, and that's what we're going to do in the next video.